Today was round 8 of the Chess Olympiad, and all eyes were on the match between the United States of America and India, two teams tied for second place just behind Armenia, and the big storyline coming into it was, can Gukesh, who was entered into the 2700 club for the first time during this tournament, continue his hot streak? He was coming in 7 out of 7, he's been winning every single game. Can he continue to tear it up? And he has the black pieces, and he's going up against Fabiano Caruana, who unfortunately has been having a little bit of a bad tournament. And Fabi, who used to be second in the world, has actually now dropped out of the top 10. Here he is. He's 13th in the world. He's had a bit of a rough go. We can make this just a little bit bigger so that it's easier to see. And the other story is Gukesh, who has just absolutely been tearing it up, crashing through the 2700 barrier all the way up to 20th in the world. So this was the main story everybody wanted to know. Can Gukesh continue to carry it up? Will Fabi's woes continue to carry with him? What is going to happen? And here's the game. It was a Sicilian defense, and we got the Rossolimo variation on the board. And honestly, this is something Fabi is probably one of the leading experts on in the world. He played a match with Magnus Carlsen called the World Championship. He had a little bit of prep for that. Probably for the candidates, he had a little bit of prep. He really does seem to know what he's doing with the white pieces in the Rossolimo. So this is going to be a very excellent battle. And after g6, we get castles, bishop to g7, takes. And this is maybe one of the first surprises, is to take on this exact move, because generally what white is doing is playing either rook to e1, so that if you need to move your bishop away, you always have this square, but also the rook on e1 makes it a little bit easier to play e5 in the future. Or white plays a move like c3, which creates a little bit of an escape square for the bishop. Maybe you can play d4 in the future. Now, instead, we saw this capture, and this was followed by yet another surprise. B takes c6, which is a little bit less common. D takes has its own reams of theory, and this is a structure that's also very well understood. But we saw B takes on c6, and now comes rook to e1. And here is where there's kind of the first question for black to figure out. The problem is, you want to play a move like pawn to d6 in this structure. However, if you do it now, you're going to be running into the move pawn to e5. And this is where potentially you have the first sort of issue for black, and this is not what was played in the game. But if you do decide to recapture here, you'll notice that after we capture back, the problem is that the queenside can get shattered and torn up. And the other problem is, if you try to play a move like pawn to d5, what's going to end up here is that your c pawn might actually become a target. So you can imagine if we put a bishop on a3 and maybe a knight comes to a4, it's the c pawn that's going to end up being the weakness. So back in this position, how did black decide to solve this issue? Well, he decides to play queen to c7, keeping control of the e5 square, so that after h3, preventing any future bishop to g4s coming in, black can now play pawn to d6. And if white wants to play e5, which is what Fabi actually did, it's going to have to be a pawn sacrifice. And this is exactly what we saw. So white has sacrificed a pawn in order to weaken the black queenside. And black in this game really had no intention of ever winning that pawn back. And in fact, after d3, getting ready to potentially bring a knight to the c4 square, or maybe even just play queen to e2, keeping control of this square, we saw black just play pawn to c4, like, here, take the pawn back. I don't want to be up a pawn. Why don't you just have it back? But here Fabi just blitzed out knight to c3. And so this must have been some prep. He played this move very quickly. You can see the times there on your screen. And after this recapture, Fabi took back with a pawn. Now, if you take back with a queen, you're going to be running into a lot of tempo moves, and the open d file means rook to d8 will be coming a little bit faster. So Fabi decides to take with a pawn, but we get this very interesting struggle. And the problem now is how to develop this knight while also keeping this pawn. Black decides, I play here, I just give back the pawn. And obviously now if we recapture here, then this knight on h6 is going to be hanging. So black has no intentions of getting the pawn back. Why don't you take the pawn? I'm going to play knight to f5. I'm going to try to keep control over this square. I'm going to try to get castled, and we'll take it from here. And we get this really interesting structure where white might be able to get all sorts of pressure down the e file. He might be able to get some pressure down the c file whenever a rook comes to c1, and black might be able to get something going on the d file. So both pawns have some weaknesses that the other opponents might be able to try to target. After bishop to f4, white decides to develop the piece, make some threats against the queen. Maybe some knight to g6 nastiness will be coming up on the next move. So the queen decides to move over. She goes to b7. She's attacking this b pawn for the moment. But now comes knight to a4. And suddenly there is a little bit of an issue for black. And that issue is this c-pawn that obviously white wants to target, and white is very happy, like, I'm already castled, I get to try to poke at some of these weaknesses before you have a chance to get fully developed. White's next move is just rook to c1, and you're going to be able to potentially win that c6 pawn. It's not going to be very easy to defend, and you would like to play the move bishop to e6. This is not what was played in the game. And this is the move that you probably would want to play with the idea that rook to c1, you can play bishop to d5, something like this to defend your pawn. But the reason this was probably not played, even though this is actually Stockfish's top choice, is the move knight to c5. This just looks like it should give white a fantastic position. But after here, the computer says you can go like this and everything is fine. This is Stockfish's top way of playing. Something like rook to c1 will continue and the game will go on. But you can understand why black wouldn't want to get that structure. And black instead decides to play pawn to f6, removing one of the attackers of the c6 square. And after the knight hops back, he gets castled. And we're going to get this interesting position where after d4, preventing black from playing e5, lunging out, we again see a situation where potentially this guy has a home. We've kind of created a little outpost square for the knight. We can imagine that the rook will be coming in. We can imagine that there's some pressure on a lot of these key squares, and it actually feels like the opening has been very successful for white. But unfortunately for Fabi, he never really found a way to get enough pressure on any of the targets. He never really found a way to break through, and here, black decides to play pawn to g5, very aggressive, attacks the bishop. After the bishop goes back, pawn to h5, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, black seems to be on the hunt. Black is going on a kingside attack. Now comes rook to e4. Defending against the move pawn to g4, and now, after queen to d7, black is ready to meet any knight to c4 with the move queen to d5. So instead we saw queen to c2, keeping an eye on this square, keeping the rook protected. We saw here, and all of a sudden black is maybe thinking of putting a bishop on f8. This is how he might be able to keep control over this square. The kids are running around having a fun time upstairs. Hopefully you can't hear them. And then he can put the rook on g7 and just try to blast through. This is some idea that you might see in a King's Indian defense, but here it's being played in this position. Now the other rook comes over, so bishop goes back to f8, queen's coming over to e2, and for a while nothing much seems to be happening. The queen comes into d5, she gets kicked back with the knight, the queen goes back, now comes queen to c4, pinning this rook. So black plays queen to b7, again, just kind of poking and prodding, but nothing's really happening. b4 gets played, okay, keeping full control over this square, and maybe white will have some future ideas of bringing the knight in. But now comes e6, breaking the pin by putting this pawn here, also opening up the bishop to potentially be able to capture on b4. So the pawn gets defended, the queen goes back, we play a little footsie, queen's going back, and it's like, okay, maybe both players should just calm down and agree to a draw right here. I think a draw would be a very likely result. But it's Fabi that decides he's going to play pawn to a3, and he is going to try to play for a win. But unfortunately, he must have miscalculated something around this point, because now black plays pawn to a5, and the position is going to open up, and basically black is going to be able to force a weakness in the queen side, but white probably expected to have some sort of counterplay in the center of the board, but it never quite works, because here in this position, we saw knight to a4, and the knight is sneaking in. The immediate threat is to fork the queen and rook, but then, okay, in the future, no problem, we're going to be going to the c5 square. So black backs up, he defends the b6 square, and there's suddenly this issue of how are you going to deal with the fact that I am threatening to take on b4. So white decides to take. Black takes back, knight to c5, and I believe it's probably this move that maybe white either underestimated or didn't quite figure out all the way through, because now all of a sudden, we are attacking this pawn. That's very true. So we have ideas of winning the a3 pawn, but white is hoping that there's some counterplay on e6. So if you take on a3, I take on e6, and hopefully everybody's just happy here. But black plays the move queen to d5, and this introduces some problems for white. And primarily, the problem is we are always going to be able to win this a3 pawn, and it's not actually true that white always will be able to win this e6 pawn. So, for example, the immediate problem is we can't really trade queens if we're white, because if you just take here, we'll be taking back, and wherever you decide to go with your rook, notice how you can't go here because of our knight, we're going to be winning this pawn, whether we take it directly or whether we toss this in first, and then, you know, we're going over after this guy, we're playing moves like pawn to e5, in order to shut this guy down and just get a huge center. Something like this would be very miserable for white to play. So you can't trade the queens. And the other problem is you need to stay connected to the rook, because if you just go somewhere random where you're protecting your pawn, obviously we need to remove this defender and just win this rook. So the queen had to go all the way back to e2, where she's keeping an eye on the rook. This gives black enough time to take on a3, and here white must have realized that you're not able to take on e6. And Fabi played rook to d1 to defend this pawn, which is important for some tactical reasons. The problem for white is, if you decide to grab on e6 right away, we are going to be taking first. And after you recapture, we noticed based on the alignment of your pieces that there is this potential forking square on d4. So black would even be able to sacrifice right here. And if you take back with a pawn, go for this fork and able to win a lot of material in addition to just damaging white's entire position. So you're never able to take. And then the other problem was, after here, defending this square so that there's no knight takes d4 at any point, here, black came up with rook to a7, and this again tactically defends against white taking on e6. So Fabi decided to play g4, making Luft, because again, if you just take here with the knight, this time the big problem is that we're playing rook to a1, and all of a sudden, the queen is connected to both of these rooks. So we have threats like maybe we will just take and then take your rook. Maybe we'll take, maybe we'll just take your rook on e4 right away. And also everything is tied down to the knight. All of the pieces are kind of tied down in an unfortunate way. So in a position like this, you're kind of wishing that you had some sort of Luft. So instead of taking right away, he plays pawn to g4. And now we saw takes, and backs it back up. And now, because the knight is creating pressure here, there's again no real time to take on e6. So white decides, okay, I'm a pawn down. I'll play knight to g3. But now comes e5, and the knight and bishop are suddenly well coordinated against this g-pawn. We're undermining this knight with our last move, and white really is in a lot of trouble. So white decides now is the time to sacrifice a piece, and I'm just going to go all out and see if I can checkmate you, or at least find some sort of threats against the king. So black decides to take back, and now we see rook takes e5. We're on the queen, we're on this pawn, you know, maybe some good stuff could still potentially happen, but no, just the cold-blooded boom, bishop takes g4, counterattacking on the queen. White decides to move away, and again, it still looks very scary. Like, if you're playing black and you're going up against Fabi, like, okay, this is still some scary stuff, but Gukesh really trusted his calculation. He plays queen to f3. White decides to grab on g5 with the rook. Rook to g7. This guy that's been patrolling the 7th rank now becomes an important defending piece. The last rook comes into the game, and now bishop to h3. Black is setting up the mating net. So Fabi tries this move, the last Hail Mary. He throws bishop to d6 on the board, and after black recaptures this way, at least white is able to take, throw in a queen check. Okay, last chance to do any sort of nonsense against the king, but the king just tucks over. And now, after knight to e4, trying to bring in the last piece, trying to get the last threat of the game in here, another amazing, beautiful move to finish it off. This one is really fantastic. Boom! Queen takes e4, and Fabi had to resign the game. Notice how the bishops are controlling the escape squares for the king. So if white were to take, there would be this back rank checkmate. You can block with your queen, you can block with your rook, but you can't last forever. Gukesh is unstoppable. Thank you. Please subscribe. Bye!